Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
About 5 years ago I went on a vacation to Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska. The cool, fresh air, beautiful scenery, and vast expanses of wilderness seemed ideal for my vacation from a tedious desk job back home. I'd saved up for years to finance the trip. I wanted my stay to be perfect. I left in late August to fly from my home in Alabama to Alaska. Everything was going great. My flight was smooth and I set out on my camping trip, alone, into the wilderness on September 1st. I hiked about 13 miles the first day and set up camp among a large area of black spruces. I started a small fire to cook some food around 6 p.m. I still remember how I felt, overjoyed that I was away from my stressful life. I lay back on the ground, looked at the stars through the trees, and listened to the fire crackle. It was a while before I began to notice the quietness of the rest of the forest. No insects, no birds, no anything. All I could hear was my breathing and the fire. Not even a breeze met the branches of the spruces. Later on, I'm not sure what time, I was woken up by a noise off in the distance. I'm not sure what it was, maybe a falling tree, but it was fairly loud. I didn't hear it again within 5 minutes, so I went back to sleep thinking it had been part of a dream. I woke up early in the morning just as the sun was coming up. I inhaled the fresh Alaskan air and got up to make some breakfast before packing up and continuing on my hike. By the end of the day, I had moved 9 miles from my original camping spot. It was a slower day, but I enjoyed taking my time and soaking in the scenery. I still hadn't seen any signs of wildlife, however. I didn't even see a bird flying above me or insects buzzing around. I didn't dwell on it, though. I felt like I was in heaven. At about 4 p.m. I saw the first sign of life in over a day, 2 hikers. They were coming the opposite direction of me, but they didn't have any gear with them. We were miles from any civilization, so it was weird seeing anyone, let alone anyone with gear. They were moving at a fairly quick pace, and I ended up having to grab one of them as they went past to ask if they were okay because they didn't even look at me. The guy the first grabbed jumped and nearly started crying, then he looked at me and said, "Turn back. It's still back there," and then he jerked away with me, grabbed his friend, who had been staring straight ahead with a glossy look about him, and started walking away, still with a quick pace. I reasoned that the guys had been doing some powerful drug in the woods for fun and had started seeing things. I set up camp and ate dinner pretty much the same way I had the night before, stargazing for a while before falling asleep. I woke up with a start several hours later to what I can only describe as a foghorn. It was low and very loud, and seemed fairly close as well. The noise echoed off of the trees, making it hard to tell where it had come from. I sat up, still sleepy, trying to wake up and figure out what was going on. I looked around, yawned, and was about to go back to sleep when I heard the sound again. This time it seemed much closer, but I still couldn't tell where it was. After a minute or two, I heard trees moving off in the distance. I heard loud snapping noises, and branches rubbing against each other and shaking. I couldn't give you guys an exact distance, but I think it was about a mile away. The first thing to come to my still sleepy mind was bear. I jumped to my feet and began looking for anything to use to defend myself from this bear, and ended up picking the hatchet I had brought. This is what the noise sounded like, only deeper and in longer bursts. I stood around in a defense stance for a good 10 minutes before I heard the sound again, this time even closer. I heard tree branches, maybe the trees themselves, snapping in the distance. It was within a mile from me, now. It then began to dawn on me that what I was dealing with wasn't a bear. My heart was beating furiously and my mind was racing to figure out what was making the sounds I kept hearing. I couldn't think of anything. The horn-like sound sounded again, this time farther away than before. I stayed up the entire night, listening to it as it got farther and farther away. By sunrise, the noise had stopped. I ate breakfast and packed up fairly quickly. I had decided I'd hike back to the car I had rented and drive off. Maybe stay in a hotel till I could get on the next plane home. It was still early, though, and I thought I'd go towards where I kept hearing the noises in hopes of finding out what they were. I got about 3/4 of a mile from where I had set up camp when I found the first tree. It was completely snapped in half, falling in the direction my campsite was. I continued on, finding more and more snapped trees. They made a trail, almost, that I started to follow, not thinking about the daylight I was wasting moving along the fallen trees. The trail went on for miles, filled with nothing but fallen trees and weird holes, like if a tree had been uprooted, all along the trail as well. I figured whatever had been here had started throwing trees as well as knocking them over. By the time I noticed it was getting dark, I had almost reached the end of the trail. I kept walking, exhausted from my sleepless night, not even noticed when the trail stopped, and decided to set up camp for the night next to a large, tall tree. It was much larger than the spruces surrounding it. It looked nothing like any evergreen I had ever seen, and its trunk was blacker than the night sky. I decided the tree had been a victim of a fire. It had plenty of branches, and my idea of setting up camp near it was so I could climb it in case whatever had been knocking over trees decided to come back. At the top of the tree was a hole, similar to one you might find in any tree, and it looked large enough for me to climb into and hide in if I could reach it. I set up my plan, ate a little bit of food, and then passed out, planning on heading back as soon as I woke up. I'm not sure how long I slept. I must have fallen asleep at around 8 p.m., so it must have been about 3 a.m. when I woke up. I was asleep on my back, clutching the hatchet in one hand, when I felt the ground tremble. You know that scene from Jurassic Park where the ground started shaking when they were in the jeeps? It felt and sounded like that, and it was right on top of me. I was pretty disoriented at first from being woken up, but I soon got a hold of my senses. I clutched the hatchet even harder and tried to open the tent I was in when an extremely bright light appeared right above me. It was blinding, partly because it was just a bright light and partly because my eyes were only adjusted to the darkness. I somehow managed to get the tent open with the full intent of running as fast as I could, and as soon as I did I looked up, trying to get a quick look at whatever was standing over me. A bright, yellow light was coming from a large oval hole in what appeared to be the tree I had planned on climbing. Only the tree was, at least it was supposed to be, about 10 feet away from me. The light came hovering, I think, about 70 feet above me. I didn't look much longer because I got out and started sprinting through the woods as fast as I could manage. I lost the hatchet at some point, but I don't think it would have done me much good. As I ran, I began to feel the ground quake like it did before, at intervals of about once every 5 seconds. Whatever it was gaining on me, but I didn't have time to think about that because the noise sounded behind, and it was incredibly loud. It sounded like it was directly behind me. I tried to scream, make any noise, really, but nothing came out. Then I ran right into something and fell and tumbled to the ground. I immediately tried to get up and keep running, but soon realized I was tangled up in someone's tent, which had apparently been abandoned. It was then that I realized I was once again bathed in the yellow light. I looked up to the light, shielding my face with my hand, and got a better view of what had been following me. The tree I had camped by was standing in front of me, bent so that the light, from what was apparently the hole I had planned on hiding in, sent a beam down directly on top of me. The trunk of the tree, if you can still call it one, was split to form what could only be described as legs, each making a rather deep imprint in the earth, like what I saw along the trail of broken trees. The tree also seemed to have arms, or long, thin, branches that hung loosely by its side. The thing stood there, unmoving, and seemed to just stare at me. The light soon became rather pretty and nice to look at, but then the tree made that awful noise again, and I snapped out of my trance. I got up and started running again, maybe even faster than before. I kept running till morning came, and then I kept going till I reached my car. I'm not sure when it stopped following, when it stopped shining its light at me, when it stopped making that horrible noise, but I didn't care. When I made it to my car, I immediately got in and drove off in the direction that I'd come in from. I nearly wrecked several times from exhaustion, but I didn't want to stop and risk meeting that thing again. I eventually made it back to civilization and got the first plane back home. I didn't sleep well for the next few weeks. I live in a fairly wooded area, though I have plenty of neighbors, and had to keep the blinds on the windows closed to keep from seeing the woods outside my house, fearful that the black tree I saw would be standing amongst the pines and oaks. I still have nightmares, and can't go on camping trips with friends. I'm thinking about moving somewhere much more open and with less trees.
The Old Man of Tundra. Long time ago in the village of Shefornak, there were stories of an old man that dragged a mysterious bag to and from throughout the tundras of Alaska. The villagers told outsiders, if they ever came close to the old man you would have to look away from him, though you were never told why. If you got in his way, he would say something of this effect, "Hey, you there. Get out of my way." You would have to answer, "No, I can stand anywhere I want to." Though sometimes it would be an extended argument. After he gives up from trying to convince you to stop obstructing his path, he would bargain with you. He would grant you one wish if you step away from his path. Some people have claimed that they would hear the old man grab something out his bag. But to this day no one knows what it is that is inside the mysterious bag, save but one man in a rumored story. A young male villager listened into a conversation about an old wandering hermit dragging around a mysterious bag. The young villager began to wonder about the mystique of the bag of this enigmatic hermit. His mind was swimming around the ideas of what could the bag contain. He became furiously curious. One day, he set out to search for this old man with a bow and arrow. He found him, and before the old man said a word he put an arrow straight through the wandering elder's forehead. With great anticipation, he opened the bag and looked inside. He did not like what he saw. The villagers were anxiously waiting for the young man to return and tell about his account with the old man. He told them that he saw what was in the bag, but he began to stutter. The villagers asked, "Well, what was in the bag?" He began to tear up, and started to cry. They kept asking, but he couldn't answer. Maybe some things aren't meant to be seen. There are still sightings of an old man dragging something in the tundras close to the Shefornak area.
I have an old hunting story possibly related to the Wendigo. I was 17 years old and my father and I had been hunting in Tongass, Alaska during deer season. We were a few miles away from camp and already returning from a successful hunt with only a couple hours of sunlight left. I decided to stay behind for a bit to map the spot we had so much success with, and I guess to sort of test the directional skills my dad had been teaching me since forever, so he went ahead. Around 20 minutes later I finished my mapping and started heading back, cradling my rifle as I walked and watching my steps because it was pretty damp at the time. Suddenly I heard some twigs snap to my right and I instantly got on my knees and hunkered in some brush, because at that moment I had seen the biggest buck I had ever seen in my life. It was behind a considerably large tree, and from my point of view all I could see was the head looking out to the forest in the direction my dad had went. I carefully raised my rifle, and as I looked through my scope I immediately knew something was off. Its eyes were a murky white and the lining of its mouth showed signs of an infection or dehydration. I guess you could say the lining of its mouth was gunky, and to top it off the fur was much thicker and untamed. Then it happened, it started moving. It came out from behind the tree, gaining massive amounts of height and walking on only its hind legs. It was about 6'7" to 6'8", and the overall look to it was that it was a deer carcass. It started walking in the direction of my dad. I wasn't afraid at this point. I had heard of some hardcore hunters in the area wearing deer carcasses as camo. So I lowered my rifle and yelled at it, "Hey!" In that split moment it turned to me and snarled like a fucking demon hound. I raised my rifle and fired a warning shot because I sure as fuck never heard that sound before in my life. It wasn't phased, and in that split moment it turned to advance towards me. I had no idea what was fucking going on at that point, because a large chunk of its rib cage looked like it had been mauled off, but it still had enough strength to go ape shit. I relied on rationality and decided it was a buck with rabies, or something. Just anything that could keep me from being afraid. I accessed that at that point I was in danger, and as it started running on all fours towards me I fired a second shot and wounded it. It made the usual wounded buck noise, freaked out in some brush for a bit, then got up and ran in the other direction on all fours. At that point I just put into my head that it was a wounded buck, and since I had taken a shot at it I was then responsible for finishing the job, so I pursued it. I followed its blood trail to a nearby clearing, but I stopped dead in my tracks because I heard a commotion involving a bear a few hundred yards ahead. Sounded like a territorial fight, so I got my scent downwind and patched my pits and groin with mud and started heading back. I was not about to fuck with a bear. I found my father and told him the whole story, and he decided we should head back because a wounded animal is a hunter's responsibility, but it was too late, so we saved it for the morning. The next morning the old man and I made it to where I had first spotted it. I explained everything in detail and he too figured it was just some sort of sick buck. We examined the foliage where it break-danced, in pain, and found odd, very thin clumps of hair that smelled of mold. My dad said he'd never seen fur like it and added some of it to his pouch. Then we followed the blood trail. We got to the point where I stopped and I showed him the direction where the bear commotion had occurred, and he then pointed out to me that the blood trail went in the same direction. We both looked at each other in a moment of relief, because it seemed that nature might have corrected itself and ended my hunt. We followed the blood to a clearing and my dad stopped and quickly put his hand to my shoulder and pointed farther out to about 30 yards away to a dead brown bear. We made our way to it and examined it in disbelief. It had been mauled severely, its stomach had been completely gutted and its entrails littered the ground around it. Its jawline was severely damaged, like something was able to grab both hands and break its jaw with sheer force. My father and I looked at each other for a moment of fright and immediately dismissed our hunt and headed home. To this day we don't know what could have done that, but man, it makes for a good campfire story.
The Extraordinary Tale of the Beast from Partridge Creek debuted on April 15, 1908, within the pages of a French journal called Sais Tout, I Know All, and was recounted by one of the creature's eyewitnesses, French traveler Georges Dupuy. According to Dupuy, the adventure had begun one day in 1903, when a banker from San Francisco called James Lewis Butler and a local gold prospector named Tom Lemore were hunting 3 large moose amid the marshy tundra countryside near the Yukon's Clear Creek, about 100 miles east of Dawson City. Suddenly, one of these burly deer raised its head as if it had heard something unexpected in the vicinity, and just as it did so a second member of the trio emitted a loud bellow of alarm, sending all 3 of them fleeing southwards with all speed. Standing 7 feet at the shoulder and weighing up to half a ton, as the world's largest living species of deer, the moose is not a creature to be readily intimidated by anything, which is why the 2 hunters were so surprised by their quarry's impromptu flight. When they reached the spot from where the moose had fled, however, the reason for these creatures' uncharacteristic behavior became clear. There in the snow was the clear impression of an enormous body belonging to some unidentifiable beast of monstrous proportions. The beast's belly had plowed into the riverbed's swampy mud a massive furrow 30 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 2 feet deep, which was flanked by gigantic footprints measuring 2.5 feet across and 5 feet in length, each also yielding impressions of sharp 1 feet long claws. Completing the clues left behind by this unseen Goliath was the imprint of a mighty 10 feet long tail spanning 16 in across its middle. The prints led several miles to a gulch known as Partridge Creek, where the track simply came to an end, giving the men cause to speculate that it must have leapt directly up into the gulch's encompassing cliffs. Following this, they made their way by canoe along the McQuestion River to the nearby outpost of Armstrong Creek, an Indian village where Butler had earlier arranged to meet Dupuy to take him hunting, and which was home to the Reverend Father Pierre Lavenu, a French-Canadian Jesuit priest. When Dupuy and the priest heard about the monster, they were highly skeptical at first, but eventually Butler persuaded them to return to Partridge Creek with Leemore and himself in a second search for it, aided by some local Indians. After a day's intensive but fruitless search of the immediate area and some distance beyond it in all directions, however, the party of weary beast hunters had resigned themselves to failure, and decided to establish camp at the top of a rocky ravine. Thoughts of confronting monsters had been largely suppressed by the more practical goal of preparing a warm meal, until, wholly without warning, they received a terrifying reminder of the reason for their presence there. A hideous roar broke the Arctic stillness, and as the startled hunters reached for their rifles, one of them pointed with shaking hand to the opposite side of the ravine, where the crimson rays of the dying sun revealed a heart-stopping sight. A veritable monster in every sense of the word was clambering up its slope. Black in color, at least 50 feet long, and estimated by Butler to weigh about 40 tons, their horrific visitor continued to climb upwards for a time, mercifully unaware of its terrified human eyewitnesses' close proximity. When it was about 200 paces away, it paused for 10 minutes or so, furnishing them with ample opportunity to observe it at close range in all its spine-chilling glory. Although profusely splattered with thick mud, its hide could be seen to bear many coarse, gray-black bristles like those of a wild boar, and a hideous mass of blood and saliva oozed from its cavernous jaws. Most remarkable of all, however, was the rhino-like horn perched prominently, somewhat incongruously near the end of its snout. As they continued to watch, the beast suddenly reared up onto its massive hind legs like a hellish kangaroo, gave voice to an ear-splitting roar again, and then disappeared back down into the ravine via a single immense bound. Not too surprisingly, the beast hunters found that the thrill of pursuing this creature had lost its former charm, and the following morning they journeyed back to Armstrong Creek. Dupuy later attempted to interest the Canadian governor at Dawson City in supplying them with a large-scale hunting party of mules and 50 armed men, but when this failed he returned home to France. The matter was not quite over, however, for in January 1908 he received a letter from Father Lavenu, dated Christmas Day 1907, in which the priest informed him that on Christmas Eve, and while in the company of 10 Indians, he had seen their monstrous quarry once again, this time racing at speed over the creek's frozen river, with what seemed to be the carcass of a caribou clamped between its great jaws. Tracks identical to those found back in 1903 were clearly visible in the deep mud, and were followed by Lavenu and company for at least 2 miles before being obliterated by falling snow.
Unusual stories are told about Wales, a small Eskimo village on the Seward Peninsula of northwest Alaska. The best known is the tale of the crawling woman. As it is told, in the days that have long since passed, boys 14 or 15 years of age left their homes to live with other boys in a large igloo called the Kazji. The Kazji functioned as a kind of boarding school. Tribal historians taught the culture and traditions of their tribe, and during the evening hours hunters came to make or repair their equipment. While the elders worked, the boys watched and learned how to make and use the weapons that they themselves would soon be using. At the end of the evening the men went home, leaving the boys by themselves to play, sing, or dance until bedtime. They were not to leave the igloo. This honor system worked well until late one afternoon when a troublemaker spotted a young girl passing the COAG and set off after her. Since the men of the village were on an extended walrus hunting trip, the remainder of the boys knew they wouldn't be caught at any mischief-making. They all rushed outdoors, caught the little girl and physically abused her. When she was able to wrench herself free, she ran screaming to her grandmother, with whom she lived alone. The grandmother, after listening to the sobbing child's story, is determined to teach the rascals a lesson they'd never forget. She painted her face with ugly streaks and patterns. Then turned around to her granddaughter. "They'll be scared of me now, won't they?" The little girl shook her head and cried pitifully, "No. Oh no, that will make them laugh." The old woman then smeared soot over her face and rubbed ashes into her hair. But the child wiped her tears and shook her head again. "There's no use, grandmother. You can never scare those boys. You wouldn't even scare me." The grandmother thought for one brief moment, then knew what she had to do. Turning her back, she went into a dark corner and removed all her clothes. With a sharp knife, she cut long, deep gashes in every part of her body. Then she got down on hands and knees and crawled toward the child, leaving a bloody trail behind her. The little girl cried and covered her face at the horrible sight. She knew that her grandmother would now terrify every boy in the COAG. The sun had set and darkness shadowed the land as the old woman crawled toward the COAG. Her movements slowed as her strength ebbed and the blood drained from her body. Standing just outside the igloo was a boy named Amezuk, the only fellow who had not abused the girl. He heard something coming toward him and grew frightened because he could not see what it was. He turned and ran inside to tell the other boys, but they called him a liar and made up a wicked song that poked fun at him. With tear-filled eyes, Amezuk turned around and saw the terrible thing entering the igloo. The figure was smeared with blood and the eyes seemed to come from the top of its head. Amezuk ran into a dark corner, bit his fingers and pushed them into a crack in the wall. As his fingers swelled, the crack held him fast, and he prayed that the thing could not pry him loose. Both of his hands ached and tears ran down his cheeks. The thing pushed through the main door and the boys could not take their eyes off it, nor could they scream their fears. Only one boy yelled, "A ghost woman." As the old lady crawled in a circle around the room, the boys, mesmerized by the movement, crawled after her. 6 times, the torn and bloodied figure circled the room, all the while beckoning Amezuk to follow her. But of course he could not, even had he wanted to. With a hideous grunt, the ghost left the igloo, crossed the tundra, and started up the mountainside. The boys followed. The next morning the men returned to the village. By this time Amezuk's knees trembled with fatigue and he felt faint. Hearing someone pass by the COAG, he called out. A man found him immediately and asked where the other boys were. "They were all taken away by a ghost," cried Amezuk. All the villagers gathered at the igloo to free the poor boy. They had cut away a portion of the wall before they got his fingers loose. Then they followed the tracks of the ghost and the boys. At the summit of the mountain they found the frozen bodies of all the boys. None was buried because each one had turned to stone. There was no sign of the old grandmother. It is said that you can see them on the mountainside behind the village of Wales, grim reminders of boys who disobeyed their elders.
What you're looking at might seem like a totally normal, boring derelict house in the middle of nowhere. What will never come to your head when you see this image though, is the idea that almost 36 people were killed in the forests and mountains right behind the house from the 1920s to the 1950s in unexplained circumstances, with their bodies never found or found mutilated in the lagoon close to the town. Portlock began its existence sometime after the turn of the century, as a cannery town. In 1921 a post office was established there, and for a time the residents, mostly natives of Russian Aleut extraction, lived in peace with their picturesque mountain and sea setting. Then, sometime in the beginning years of World War II, rumors began to seep along the Kenai Peninsula that things were not right in Portlock. Men from the cannery town would go up into the hills to hunt the Dall sheep and bear, and never return. Worse yet, the stories ran, sometimes their mutilated bodies would be swept down into the lagoon, torn and dismembered in a way that bears could not, or would not, do. One resident saw a huge, hairy man destroying fish wheels along the beach. He ran back to get his gun, and when he returned, the beast just stared at him and walked off. With these sightings, unease began to ramp up in the town. Bodies that were recovered, having washed down the rivers into the lagoon, had strange wounds no bear could make. The loss of these lives took a toll on the small community, and fear set in. People started to leave. With unexplained disappearances and murders, no one felt they could take a chance and continue to live here. Tales of murder and mayhem rolled out of Portlock on a regular basis in the 1930s and 1940s, gaining steam during the World War II years. Port Graham elder, Simeon Kvasnikov, told of the unexplained disappearance of a gold miner near the village during this time. "He went up there one time and never came back," said Kvasnikov. No one found any sign of him. In 1900, a group of hair-covered creatures ran at a prospector who had climbed a tree in an attempt to get his bearings near Thomas Bay. The prospector said they were the most hideous creatures. "I couldn't call them anything but devils." The prospector, upon seeing the creatures advancing on him, was able to drop down out of the tree, get to his canoe, and make his escape in the nick of time. He had no doubt in his mind that, had he not seen the creatures in time, they would have made short work of him. In 1990, an Anchorage paramedic was called out to aid a 70-year-old native who had suffered a heart attack but was incarcerated in the Eagle River Jail north of the city. While treating the man, the paramedic happened to mention he had hunted in the area of Port Chatham. The elderly man suddenly sat up, grabbed the medic by the shirt and asked, "Did it bother you? Did you see it? So, what do you think is lurking in those woods/x/?"
Be me. Mom worked for NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so moved around a lot as a kid. End up in Juneau, Alaska for a few years. Lived on Douglas Island, so houses around, but not in town. Early 2000s, so as kids we could go fuck around and do whatever we want so long as we were home by a certain time. Can't use the sun as a metric since in winter it got dark before I got out of school and at like 2 a.m. in summer, or if our parents called us over walkie-talkies. Springtime. Grandma had a stroke and went blind just before spring break, so Mom had me stay at a friend's house while she flew down there. Hanging out with a few kids in his neighborhood. Decide to go walk around in a woods. End up in a blueberry thicket just before the muskeg. Just messing around. Playing war with the 5 of us. Suddenly hear what sounds like cooing coming from what smelled like skunk cabbage. We all head towards it. A very small gorilla-looking thing. Get closer and realize the thing has no face. Just a blank white area where the face would normally go on a person. Older friend of ours puts his hand out and moves closer to it and it does the same. Its fingers are webbed. The closer he gets the more time seems to slow down. Eventually time just fucking stops. Looking at what is practically the creation of Adam but a middle school boy with weird ape thing. Suddenly time fast forwards and we're sprinting out of the forest towards the house screaming our heads off. Make it to the road and keep running. Eventually we stop and turn around. Big ass one is standing on the edge of the forest just looking at us. "What are you guys running from?" Fucking jump out of our skins. It's a few girls we went to school with. One I had a mega crush on. Look back and the big one is hauling it back into the forest towards the muskeg. We all just play it cool and say, "Nothing. You guys look really scared though. We try to laugh it off and say, just messing around. Spend the rest of the afternoon jumping on a trampoline with the girls. Later on end up back at the house. Ask my friends if we just imagined that or if it really happened. No one will look at each other or say anything. Friend's mom ends up ordering us pizza even though she's a health freak because she thinks I'm sad about my grandma and we're just really tired from playing outside and everybody needs a pick-me-up. She asks why we didn't respond on the walkie earlier. Realize in the fracas we dropped the fucking thing. Tells us we have to find it tomorrow. Fuck that. Temp, eat our pizza and head upstairs to sleep. Except no one can sleep. Hear what sounds like something crawling on the roof. One guy says, probably just a cat. Eventually hear a rhythmic tapping on the window. No one fucking moves. No one even really breathes. Eventually it stops and then crawls down. We're all scared shitless but manage to pass out somehow. Eat bran flakes and granola for breakfast because it is healthy. Walk outside to find the walkie we had no intention of looking for. Walkie is just sitting on the front porch. Fast forward to summer 2008. Have since moved away but mom wants to go there on vacation since one of my aunts lives there now. Being sweaty teenager on the verge of graduation, I chalk up my previous experience to being an imaginative child. Also being a sweaty teenager, I don't want to go, so drag the fuck out of my feet and demand being allowed my laptop so I can play Vidya in the hotel. Mom agrees. Be there a couple days. Doing stuff during the day and playing games in the hotel at night. Only dark between 2 and 4 a.m. so can't really sleep anyway, even with a blanket over the window. One night look at the clock. 2:27 a.m. Computer freezes up. Try to force restart but nothing happens. Try again and again. HP piece of shit.jpg. Go and get some water to cool off before I break something. Look at clock again. 2:27 a.m. Think, no fucking way. Then hear the rapping at the window. Look at clock again. 2:27 a.m. Realization hits. They remember. Robert Muldoon. Say nothing. Do nothing. Just sit motionless. Tapping stops. A single scratch goes from one part of the window to the other. Laptop suddenly shuts off. Look at clock. 4:19 a.m. Haven't been back to Alaska since, nor do I ever plan to return. Fuck that and fuck you.
I grew up in Alaska. I was born there, and didn't move down to the mainland until I was 12. My mother and father weren't from there, but had been living there for almost a decade before I was born. Anyway, this happened when I was 10. My father and I had just finished a day of visiting some friends of his who live out in the wilderness a bit, and the road home took us through some forest. It's in November, so there's already plenty of snow, and it's really dark in general. It's also around 10:30 p.m. He's driving and I'm in the passenger seat. It's 1-2-lane road with woods on either side. As we're driving, I notice something out of the corner of my eye that makes my heart stop. On the right side of the road, in the trees, briefly illuminated by the headlights, is a man. He's clearly visible between the trees. He's lumbering quickly through the snow towards the road, with his arms stretched out. Not in a menacing way, it's like he's desperately trying to reach us. Jesus Christ, his face. He looked almost frozen, his beard covered in ice. His eyes were wild, sunken in. His mouth was opened in what seemed like a silent scream. I immediately scream as the car passes him, covering my face in my hands. My dad looks at me and asks me what's wrong. All I can get out is that there was a man trying to get to us on my side of the road. My dad puts the car in reverse, while locking the doors and pulling his Glock out of the glove box. We quickly get back to where I saw him, and he's gone. There aren't even any tracks in the snow. My dad slightly rolls his window down and calls out, "Does anyone need help?" No one answers, so we drive away. My dad is wearing a grimace now, and it's my turn to ask him what's wrong. He replies, puzzled, that he feels really sad but he has no idea why. He assures me that I must have seen a tree and mistaken it for a person. We get home about half an hour later. My mom is already sleeping, but I don't feel like sleeping whatsoever, so I get some stale coffee out of the pot. I'm not supposed to drink coffee, especially at night. My father sits by me and asks me if I wanted to stay up because I was scared of what I thought I saw. I tell him I did see a scary guy in the trees. He humors me and asks me to describe the man. I describe him as best I could, and my father's face goes white. He wakes my mother up and asks her if she's ever shown me a picture of a Mark. She hadn't. I didn't know any Mark. My dad comes out of the room with a picture and asks me if it's the man I saw. I immediately reply in the affirmative. It's the man from the woods, albeit much healthier, in high spirits, next to my dad. Mark had been a good friend of my father and had died a year after I was born. Nobody had ever told me about him. He went missing and was found weeks later in the woods after his car was discovered on the side of the road. He had frozen to death 5 miles from his car. No one knows if he got lost or if he went out there to die. My dad hugs me tight for several minutes, then helps himself to some coffee. My mother is brought up to speed and is understandably freaked out. The three of us stay up all night watching Arnold Schwarzenegger movies together, to take our minds off of it, I guess. My father doesn't like talking about it, but he won't refuse to, and admits that it made him a believer in the paranormal. That's the spookiest story I have, and my only paranormal experience.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.